welcome, folksy folks. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore. I am Vanessa Y. Rogers, your hostess of the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. In this show, our show is all about origins. We're pulling on threads that lead us back as far back as that thread will take us, whether that thread is an urban legend, a mythological story, or a superstition. We want to understand its history and its context. One of the previous episodes, our guest Dr. McElroy talked about superstitions, and that was episode 65. One of the superstitions was not to whistle at night in Africa so as not to attract spirits. Later, I came across another superstition about whistling in Australia, only specifically in a graveyard, so a ghost wouldn't follow you home. Sailors also have a superstition about whistling. They believe that whistling changes the wind, and sailors often worked in theaters because they were good at knots and ropes and rigging, and so actors began discouraging the act of whistling because they believed it was bad luck. In Ukraine, if you whistle, they believe you go broke. I had a hard time pinpointing any sort of reason, except that whistling seemed to be universally bad luck globally. And I love to say this show is about building bridges, but it's also about connecting dots to see where those dots lead you. And on this folklore podcast, I'm always amazed at the wisdom with which my guests bring, and you will be too. So make sure you're hitting that subscribe button, whether you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform like Apple or Spotify or iHeartRadio, whatever it is you listen to, so you get notifications on a weekly basis when our podcast drops. We have a fantastic show for you today. You're going to love this one. Ivy Lewis is our guest. She's an RAF veteran, which stands for Royal Air Force. Uh, she's a war artist. Her war collection is held in the Royal Air Force Museum. She specialized in folklore and religion in the Middle Ages in her undergraduate and postgraduate degree. She is the author of a novella, And Where Will You Go, Deedon, right?
Van Deeden.
And as well as her debut novel, Ferrishyn, set to release at the end of November 2024. It's romance set in a futuristic war zone, blending elements of sci-fi and folklore into what she's calling Fae-Fi. Our show today will be about connecting lots of dots between place lore, how fairies are represented through the lens of medieval Christian lens, and what that means for modern representation in Fae literature today. We'll be talking about the intersection between the natural world and the fairy tales, as well as Ivy's books and how she reimagined folklore in her upcoming works. So thank you so much for joining us, Ivy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So let's get into your journey about being a novelist. How did that occur?
Yeah, interesting question. So probably like lots of people who write books, I've been writing for a long, long time. So I've been writing since I was about 15, 16. So that's a good 20 odd years now. I've always written just for fun, just for the pure enjoyment of it, as a lot of us do. And the book Ferrishyn, which is out at the end of this month, I actually wrote the first draft 10 years ago when I got back from Afghanistan. So I'd written it and kind of played around with it, sat on it for a while, and then life goes on as it does. And I was due to start a PhD in creative writing last September on the pretty much the topic we're talking about today. And so as part of my PhD application, I sent my draft of Ferrishyn to my old professor so that he could write a supporting statement for me to do the PhD. And he read the book and he said to me, it's actually pretty good. And I thought, well, he's not the kind of guy who's gonna lie to me about these things. So I went back, I revisited, I started playing with it again, got a little bit sucked in, sent it off to publishers, got a publishing deal, and then went, oh, whoops, now I've got to choose between the PhD and writing, with time being what it is. So obviously I went with Ferrishyn, and kind of a year later, here we are. So I guess I'm a little bit of an accidental novelist. It really wasn't from intention.
Well, so your degrees, what are your degrees in?
So my first degree is in ancient world studies, which is quite a broad title because it is a fairly broad spread. So for the first couple of years, I did Latin and Greek. So I learned ancient languages. I then picked up paleography, I just smashing old English for my undergraduate, ancient history, things around mythology, the early Middle Ages, and I really got quite hooked on the Middle Ages in that degree. So I spent my third year studying kind of the more folklore elements, going into like voyages in the other world, so the afterlife, hence my interest in kind of purgatory and hell and that kind of thing. Demonic possession rituals, which I looked at from all the way back from ancient Assyria through Judaism into Christianity and kind of the more modern period as well, with almost like quite a anthropological look at it. So my first degree was quite broad. And then when I did my master's, I settled into the Middle Ages, and demonic possession and exorcism was kind of my bag, which is how I got into folklore, because obviously you start studying one, you get drawn into the others.
Yeah.
And I worked on Old English texts, paleography again, manuscript studies at the British Library. So obviously, paleography is essential for the reading. And yeah, that's kind of where I ended.
And did a lot of this research inspire you to start writing your novels?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's just as a kid, I'd always been really into fantasy. I think quite a lot of kids are, like Lord of the Rings. I was that generation. I don't know if you've ever heard the radio adaptation. Maybe not because you're in America, but in the UK there was a radio adaptation of the story, and that was something that I loved as a kid. And so obviously I read a lot of fantasy books, and then I was really into history, and the school that I went to. Again, over here in the UK, you kind of have the two schooling systems. You have the state school, which is kind of where everyone goes if they're not rich. And then you have obviously the private schools, which are paid for. So I went to a state school, and I really loved history, and I really loved everything academic, but I didn't get the opportunity to learn ancient languages or anything like that. So when I had that opportunity at university, that was something that I really went for. And I just think it's I love folk tales because they're kind of a little bit unfinished. They're sort of little, small snapshots of bigger stories, and then they feed into bigger mythologies, and then there's worlds within worlds, and then it throws up the really big questions around good and evil, which obviously you get into theology as well. And I think that's really what feeds into my writing. That kind of, I think it's almost a way of me framing my own thoughts about the world and the nature of humanity and all that stuff. So yeah, it's big ideas compressed into the word on the page, I guess.
It's a really great quote about fiction work not being false. It's about finding truth in the world. I can't remember do you know what I'm talking about? There's a beautiful quote about like fiction. Yeah, I don't remember what it is.
Similar to Levi-Strauss.
Say it again.
Maybe Levi-Strauss. Maybe Levi-Strauss. He says, "Man doesn't think in myths. Myths think in man."
Oh, that's a good one. I don't know that one, but I like that one. Very cool. But one of the things I think I read in your notes was that you created a language for your novel. Is that right?
Yeah, I did. Yes.
Just like
Sorry.
So I know J.R. Tolkien was famous for this, and I think that he had said something along the lines of he basically wrote the stories so that he could create this language that he made for the books. Was that how yours kind of worked as well, or did you just love languages so much you just kind of wanted to do that, try your hand at it?
Yeah, I think mine's more the love of languages, and I'll be really honest. If you read Latin, you'll pick it up fairly quickly because it is very much a bastardized form of Latin. And Latin I absolutely adore. And when I was writing Ferrishyn, because we're talking about probably get onto, but we're talking about planes of existence slightly beyond our world. So we're talking about the fairy realms. So it made sense to me that the people who lived in those realms would probably speak a similar language, but not the same language to the one that we speak, or the ones that we've come across historically. So you've got the slightly bastardized form of Latin, which the Fens speak, and then you've got fairly heavy Old Irish Gaelic, which the she speak. But I've played with it a little bit. If if you've ever read Gaelic, you'll understand that some of the pronunciation, well, like we said at the start, Gondian is quite tricky. So for a reader, it's not necessarily natural to pronounce the words the way they should be pronounced. So I made it a little bit easier for people where I could, and included a glossary and all kind of stuff.
For me, Gaelic is the most like foreign of any language because you look at, the letters, the alphabetical letters, and you try and pronounce it, and like about half of the letters should not be pronounced. And I'm always like, why are there so many letters in this word? So
They are tricky. They're really tricky.
Um, so that's very interesting to me. Like, I'm not a language person at all. I'm really terrible with pronunciation, and I'm not good with learning other languages. So that does not sound like a fun endeavor at all for me. But uh, that's great that other people just find languages. I've had several linguists on this show, and I'm just always amazed at like how they love languages, and I would love it too if it came easy. But that's so interesting that you added another language. I'm sure other linguists will geek out on that element of your book.
It's definitely a little geek bit.
One of the things that you also mentioned that you studied was eco-critical theory and eco-semiotics. Those were completely foreign words to me. So can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so this is where we dip into my PhD stuff. So this is kind of the area. Well, I may write a book about it. I'm undecided yet, but this may be the area that I take forward. I may go and do the PhD. Who knows? So eco-critical theory is more about how we interpret literature. So how we read texts and how they might relate to the world around us with an eco-critical concern. So one example that I always think is quite an easy one because it's quite well known is if we think of the film Avatar, which again has been huge over the years. It's got that real, what I would say is an eco-critical angle. We're talking about the destruction of resources, colonialization, a real anthropocentric view of the world rather than a biocentric. So I mean, we can delve into other things. So for instance, like the fall of the house of Usher is eco-critical in terms of it's an entropic system, but that's, it's going a bit deep. Moby Dick is another one, classic literature, which would have an eco-critical kind of aspect to it. But it's works that have something to say around the natural world, our interactions with it, positive or negative. And, sometimes these are intentional commentaries and criticisms, which is obviously what I've done with my work. So Ferrishyn is very much an intentional criticism. Other times they're less so. Other times it's just hinted at, or it's just, maybe it's the zeitgeist, it's the popular thing to be talking about. So it's kind of got drawn into the work that way. And then when we think about eco-semiotics, so again, it's a relatively new discipline. It's branching off from semiotics, which we'll have all come across at some point in our life. We come across it in day-to-day life. So for instance, you see the McDonald's M, you know instantly what it is. It doesn't say McDonald's, it doesn't say food, it doesn't say any of those things, but you see that M and you know what it is. It's a sign, it's a branch of semiotics. So eco-semiotics is about how the natural world looks to the species that inhabit it. So for instance, a simple way of looking at that is we talk about a concept called the Umwelt, which just means the environment, but that's what we're talking about in eco-semiotics. If we think about a garden, just your average garden, it's probably got some grass in it, it's probably got a hedge, maybe it's got a fence, maybe in the autumn it's got some fallen leaves. If we were to put an eco-semiotics head on that and to look at it from a hedgehog's perspective, to consider the Umwelt from a hedgehog's perspective, we'd be thinking, right, what do I need? I need some leaf litter because it's got insects in that I can eat. I need some shelter to hide from predators. And then maybe I'll look at the fences that are around this garden and are they accessible? Can the hedgehog get through them? Are they stopping the hedgehog from getting in and out? So it's a way of considering the environment from a particular species point of view. So where it became quite interesting to me, and I'm sure we'll get onto it later in the pod, is how fairies, folkloric creatures, how they interact with their environment, because the two are inextricably linked. That you can't have folklore without environment. So my area of interest is essentially the umvelt of fairies. What do fairies need? Where do they inhabit? What things do they need to flourish? What things send them away? If we were to do something different, would we be encouraging fairies into a particular environment in a hypothetical way? So that's kind of where my area of interest lies in that.
And there was a paper you sent me that had that talked a lot about bogs, and that there's a lot of stories around bogs. Can you tell our listeners about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting research paper, and it's about place law. And bogs are quite a good one, because I think they have quite a common. I think you mentioned it, actually, didn't you, on an earlier pod about will-o'-the-wisps and being in pollution, as well as in the British Isles. But it's about how place interacts with the law and how law interacts with the place. So you've got a marshland or a bog where people have historically potentially gone into danger, lost their lives, disappeared. And so from a sort of a folkloric perspective, a story will be created to explain why that happens. We know quite often in bogs we have the phenomenon of marsh gas. So we see the little lights that are described as will-o'-the-wisps. So one of the stories that tends to come up around these marshlands is that, the will-o'-the-wisps, they lead you astray, and you go off into the marsh and you die. There's stories about a blacksmith as well, isn't there? And there's various other things, but they're essentially the same kind of thing. Marshes are dangerous places, and they're dangerous places because this folkloric creature is there and it's going to harm you. So that's one way of interpreting it. But equally, the other way of interpreting it is to flip it the other way around. You've already got a dangerous place, and you have to come up with a reason for it to be dangerous. And so where that's quite interesting is that's the interaction between place law and folklore, and how environment specific places give rise to particular folkloric beliefs, which probably explains why we have this commonality of beliefs, across location. I.e., marshes are the same throughout the world, therefore they're going to have similar kind of phenomena. People are going to die in them. We kind of need this explanation behind them. So it's a really interesting way of reading place, and it's an eco-semiotic way of reading place.
Yeah, it makes me think. We had the fairy tale flip episode about the blacksmith, but also the Christian Andersen's the girl who trod on a loaf, and she falls into a bog, down into the land underneath with the marsh woman and also the devil. So I had never piece that together, as bogs are dangerous places, and the will-o'-the-wisp. That's interesting. You're putting pieces together for me.
So you've got the other bit that made interesting. You described that story as well. So if you think of the going down, and we'll get onto this later. So, fairies are commonly described as coming from under the ground, whether through she mounds, St. Martin's land, as they're referred to in one tale, lands beneath, which is where we kind of get this vague link with hell, but not quite hell, almost a kind of other world. So it all pieces together in various different ways.
Oh, so in my head, I guess I've never come across a story where fairies come up from the ground. Um, they, so that's interesting. Can you tell us one of those stories, just so in case any of our listeners also are like myself?
No, it's fine. If we think of fairy, so fairy, and you probably possibly discussed this on other pods, but if we think about what a fairy is essentially a secular supernatural being. So it's a supernatural being outside of any organized religion. So, Christianity is a nice easy one. Within the organized religion, we have, God and the devil, we have angels. It's fairly straightforward. But then you also have this kind of separate secular category, which is where the fairies sit. And if we think back to even like ancient Greece, you've got nereids, dryads, things that kind of sit a little bit outside of that. To link it back to what you're talking about with under the ground, probably the most important link there is to think about the Tuatha Danann from Ireland. So the Tuatha Danann are thought of as being a race of kind of elder gods, and they inhabit the land of Ireland. Ireland's a bit of a strange strange country in that it doesn't really have any origin stories. It's always considered to have kind of been there, you know, and various different people inhabit it. So the Tuatha Dé Danann are this kind of magical race of demigods, gods, and they become associated with she mounds. So she is the word for mound in Ireland, and it also becomes the name for fairy. So you would call a fairy a she in Ireland, but when you're talking about she, what you're generally talking about is the Tuatha Dé Danann. So we think about them as inhabiting these mounds, these green mounds. So coming from under the ground. Equally, if we look back into medieval texts and we think about the green children, have you come across that story?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, William of Newburgh. I think it's William of Newburgh. I'd have to check notes, but in Woolpit, in fairly near to where I live, actually, the two green children, when they're found, they're considered to be fairy children. And the little boy pines away and dies. And the girl obviously flourishes and survives. And when she's asked about where she comes from, she describes coming from a land beneath the earth, which is called St. Martin's Land. So there's a really strong association with fairies coming from beneath the ground. In various different stories, if you think about the romances, medieval romances, quite often there's a portal in a hill, which takes you through to Elfheim or Elfland, whichever way you want to call it. So yeah, it's a really strong association. But if we were to find at least in the British Isles, and I can't really speak for the British Isles, if we were to really find an origin for it, we'd probably talk about the she and the Tuatha Dé Danann in Ireland.
So interesting, because I've heard of the fairy rings, but not the mounds. But I guess a lot of times the rings are maybe around a mound.
Yeah, sometimes fairy rings are, again, it takes us a little bit into eco-semiotics again, because what we're talking about is a mushroom ring, right? And it's to how we relate to the natural world. So when we look at the natural world, we look at it and we still read it in well, some of us do anyway, we still read it in a folkloric way. So yeah, the rings can be to do with portals. The mounds generally that we're talking about are burial mounds. So again, you've got that association with the dead. So there's quite often a big crossover of beliefs, and we could probably drive ourselves to distraction trying to find some kind of like continuity, you know, some kind of textual thread. But yeah, there's a lot of mixed beliefs.
Okay, so we're on the topic of fairies. So one of the things that you looked at in your work is the idea that they represent in different cultures. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about the Tuatha Dé Danann, obviously, who I think are really, really important. When we think about fairies in all cultures, we're going back to that original definition. We're going back to that idea of a secular supernatural being, and that's pretty much applicable throughout. Sometimes they are conceived of as a pagan deity that's gone on to become this secular supernatural, which the Tuatha Dé Danann are. Again, I can't speak to other cultures, but there'll be plenty of other examples of this. But it's always interesting to think about the role that they serve for a culture. So whenever we think about fairies, we're thinking generally about a creature that is on its way out, but hasn't quite been pushed out of consciousness. So it's usually either because of an ethnic reason, so a different ethnic group has shoved them out of their natural homeland. It can be for a religious reason. So when we think about Christianity coming into the British Isles and pushing out older beliefs, or the other reason, which I suppose is fairly relevant now as well, is to do with industrialization and post-industrialization. So the Victorian sensibility around fairies was around this feeling that the world was becoming, mechanized, industrialized, wild spaces were diminishing. So there was this kind of renewed interest in fairies, which ironically they kind of is today, right? It's a very similar feeling environment. So they kind of they serve lots of roles within cultures, but they serve a role of being other in many different ways, in terms of their liminality, in terms of their morality. You know, they're kind of this thing that's sort of familiar to us, but just stands a little bit outside. And folk and fairy tales give us a way to examine our own culture in that way.
And you say that the way that medieval Christians' worldview, uh, that worldview affects how we see and interpret fairies in modern times. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, and again, I would say, this is very much, I'm looking from a Western British Isles worldview. It's going to be very, very
Right.
different if we go further across the world, and again, obviously in areas that aren't Christianized, for want of a better word. But if we think about medieval Christianity, which in itself is quite a fascinating religion to study, we look at how the different the schema of the world was developed. So it's quite important to think about where our world sits and where we go when we die, which in all honesty in Christianity is one of the biggest focuses. Where do you go when you die? That's kind of what life is about, right? You're either going to heaven or you're going to hell. So hell is, I probably shouldn't use the term, but hell is invented, for want of a better term, during the Maccabean revolt at around 160 BC. It's when people first started thinking about an apocalyptic way of viewing the world. So before then, you had talk about Sheol, the grave, and it's translated various different ways. It's sometimes translated as hell, sometimes translated as the grave. But that kind of real thinking of hell as this place of damnation that you go to, or separation, as it is more accurately, wasn't really conceived of until the Maccabean revolt. So we've got that. Obviously the idea of heaven, where God is, where all good things are, being in union with God. And we've got these two places. But this is slightly problematic. It's slightly problematic in that there are quite a few conditions you have to fulfill in order to get to heaven. But equally, you're probably not going to be bad enough to go to hell. So you kind of need to go somewhere else, because we're obviously talking Catholic Christianity here rather than Protestant Christianity or any other form. So a way of solving this problem was to come up with the doctrine of purgatory, i.e. this kind of waiting room that you can go to, which was solidified in the 13th century, 12th century, I think, 12th century, 13th century. But this idea of a waiting room where you go if you've been pretty good, not quite good enough to get to heaven, and not awful enough to go to hell. You've not got original sin, you've not got some terrible sin, but you're still a bit rubbish and you still need to kind of work a bit to get to heaven. So that's great. We've got then these three places. We've got hell, we've got heaven, we've got purgatory. But it also throws up another problem. So obviously this is why medieval Christianity is really, really important and quite interesting, because they think about the big problems. That they really think about good and evil, and and the condition of souls, and this massive problem of evil. So you've got this other category of people. You've got good people who were born before the advent of Jesus. So you've got holy men who would not have been baptized, therefore still had original sin, but actually were without any other sin. So there was a problem of where to put them, essentially. So in the harrowing of hell, Jesus goes down and he pulls up the fathers, as they're known. And it's like, well, where do we put them? We can't put them in heaven because they've got original sin. They're not baptized. So this is where the idea of the limbo of the fathers was developed, to the limbus patrum. So if you are this, this holy man who's not been baptized, you go to limbo. You're not in communion with God. You're still separate from God, but you're not suffering as such, only suffering in that you're not in communion with him. And they go there. And then there's another problem, which is kind of a more practical problem. And I think, purgatory is quite a practical problem. It's probably for the likes of you and I, people who are not saints, who are not excellent. A very practical problem is what happens to children who are born with original sin, but are born before they're baptized. So born before they're die, born with original sin, die before they're baptized. That's me making a really important point there in a really bad way. So you've got this child who has committed no life sin. They've not done anything evil. They've not committed any crimes. But because they've not been baptized, they can't get to heaven. And they also can't go to purgatory because they've not been baptized. So there was this massive problem. What do we do with these children? Where do they go? And so this is where they developed a second concept of limbo. which is the limbus puerorum, the limbo of the children, and that's where these little children go. You read like really, really sad stories of parents burying their unbaptized children under the eaves of churches, so that when the water runs off the roof, they feel like their child is being baptized. You know, it's really, really, really heartbreaking stuff.
Wow.
So there's this real need to kind of systematize the world. You know, we've got Earth, we've got the living. Where does everyone go when they die? How does this fit in around good, around evil? You know, and really setting out this schema of the world. Now, where this is, and this is like a really long-winded explanation to get back to your original question. So where this is important is, where do we then put fairies? Where do we put these folkloric beings? Where do they sit within this schema of who goes up and who goes down? And the general feeling around fairies is that they are too good for hell and that they're too bad for heaven. And then there's this whole problem. They're obviously not baptized, so they're not going to go, you know, to purgatory. They're probably not going to go to limbo either. And I think there's more of a sense of, you know, they're not dead, so we can't put them there either. They're this being that kind of straddles the world between the living and the dead. And so they're a real problem in many, many ways. You know, some texts, you'll see them interpreted as ghosts. So Dando's dogs, or Hurla is obviously a later text, but got its origin sort of in Pelican and stuff like that, a host of the dead, which probably harks back to the Sluashi, you know, a kind of a fairy host of the dead. But they are this real problematic group of creatures for the medieval world. And consequently pulling that forward, because obviously the Western world is seen generally now through a Christianized lens, you know, even down to our laws and the way we operate in the world, we still kind of have this feeling of fairies being slightly liminal, morally grey creatures that are maybe a little bit beyond the system of things, even though they are very, you know, they're about as natural as they come in terms of their relationships with the natural world. They sit very much outside the human world. And I think that's why they're still quite interesting, and it's still quite important to recognize the influence of Christianity on that way of seeing them.
Where did they play? Where did they go when they die in the Catholic medieval Christian view? Like, did they just not go anywhere?
Well, this is the peculiarity of fairies. You know, do they die is one question.
Oh, right.
We don't know. Do they die? Is St. Martin's Land, which we talked about earlier, is this, you know, this whole other realm of existence that we think of as fairy? Or are they ghosts? Are they ghosts that were too bad even for hell, which some of them are conceived of as being? You know, I think it's Herm or Hurla, might even be Dando. One of them is too bad for hell. You know, hell rejects them, so they're doomed to troop the world forever. And this is what, you know, I don't think, and someone may come on here later and correct me, but I don't think there's ever been any concrete answer of you know, what we do with these creatures. And I think that's what makes them so interesting, because they don't really fit in that scheme. You know, they're not angels, they're not demons.
What about animals? Where do they fit?
Animals are quite easy because they don't have souls.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, you want the straight up Christian answer? An animal doesn't have a soul. So what makes mankind unique is our soul, and that's what makes us, you know,
okay,
creature of interest to God.
Okay, so that was a very fascinating. I'm glad you went into all the detail. I love that. That was really fascinating. Okay, then so you also look at demonic possession, and I know that this is a specialty of yours. So just like a shortened version, because you mentioned before maybe having you come on and talk primarily about this topic, because this is a fascinating topic. We had someone, I had a guest on, his name is eluding me right now, who came on and talked about the books and Jewish folklore, which is fascinating, and it's just one little element of demonic possession. So tell us about how demons and the placement of fairies in medieval Christian worldview worked.
Okay, so the interesting thing about possession was to me not really so much even in the phenomena itself. There are academics who study that. Barbara Newman is fantastic. She talks about the role of demoniac women, you know, how that fits in and this kind of stuff. We can talk about the desert fathers going off into the desert to do battle, for want of a better word, with these demons, and the role that serves within Christianity. But the interesting thing about demonic possession is the exorcism ritual that comes with it. So there has been a form of possession
Okay,
and
can we
an
define what a
exorcism
demon
type
is?
ritual. Sorry?
Can we define what a demon is?
Yeah, so it will vary between cultures. So if we're going
Okay.
Christian, then it's a fallen angel.
Okay.
It's Lucifer, his clan, the Book of Enoch, the rebellion, the fall, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Devil's sometimes seen of as being kind of like minor league, kind of nasties, which are not quite the same as the angels, but Lucifer and his bunch are fallen angels.
Okay.
And the whole other thing that I think is for another day. But if we think about other cultures, for example, Syria, a demon is more similar to kind of being a demigod, like a creature that has power to do good for you or to do evil, but is not really associated in this big good versus evil worldview, because obviously that's the worldview that they held. So that, again, what's quite peculiar about Christianity, it gives you those distinct polarities, good and evil. But we go back to ancient Assyria. You've got a headache, or your cow dies. Maybe it's a bad demon that caused that to happen, and so you might want to perform a ritual to appease the demon, get rid of them. Lilith, for instance, who is obviously mentioned in the Bible, she comes from Assyria, and she's a whole other classification of their demon. So there's lots of textual continuity. You mentioned Judaism, it comes to us through Judaism and then into Christianity. So the bit that I found interesting was the exorcism ritual. What is common to these rituals, if we go all the way back through history, what stays the same, what is different? So one commonality that you will find in every type of exorcism ritual is something that gives life. So sometimes it's salt, which is obviously essential for life. Sometimes it's grain, it's the food of the living. The rituals themselves vary. The wording of the rituals vary, but there's always this sense that you use something of the living to drive out this demon. And that was that I found interesting, because, when we're talking about all of this, when we're talking about folklore, when we're talking about religion, what we're talking about is, people's shared beliefs. Like, we're human, we kind of all think in roughly the same way. We think in terms of living and dead, probably good and bad, but in slightly different ways. And it's how those rituals speak to us with a commonality. So all the way back through Syria, like I say, through Judaism into Christianity, you have this same kind of sense of using something from the living to drive out the dead. Where this links into folklore and fairies is, obviously, if you start delving into these texts, which I've spent a disproportionate amount of time doing, you end up going into what they call exemplar, which are little stories usually with a moral attached to them, kind of didactic moral, and they kind of involve all sorts of weird and wonderful supernatural things. You'll find necromancy in there, you'll find witches, you'll find fairies, you'll find orcs. So you kind of end up going down rabbit holes. And it's like tangential thinking, which brings this whole world together and takes us back to what we talked about earlier, this problem of where fairies fit. Are they demons? Can you exorcise a fairy? No, you can't.
Interesting. Okay, so let's get into some modern representations, because I think fairy folklore, fairy literature is, I don't know if it ever went out of fashion, but it's definitely very popular today. You mentioned Sarah J. Maas, and I know I've read the A Court of Roses and Thorns series. That's one of her most popular ones, and there's a lot of fairy lore in that one. Can you just talk about what we're seeing today?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I don't think fairies ever really did go out of fashion. I think they've been represented in various different ways, and I think the appeal remains the same throughout. They're morally grey, right? They're these things that are kind of not quite good, not quite bad. We know that they're powerful. They're powerful in ways that are different to us. I think we quite like that they're associated with nature and elemental magic, and and really old arcane stuff. Like Sarah J. Maas draws on, for instance, the cauldron, which is a Tuatha De Danann myth, and obviously her names are, Tamlin is obviously the fairy tale of Tamlin. So she sort of delves in and out of this fairy tale world. Holly Black, I think I mentioned as well. She's like more young adult, but again, she draws on a lot of fairy tale creatures. She's got Elfheim, the realm of fairy, and I think we all quite like this idea of a place beyond our own world, where things are maybe not quite so straightforward in terms of good, bad, what's possible, what's not possible. Everyone likes magic, don't they? Everyone kind of likes this idea of magic. And again, fairies are kind of, not all of them, but I think the trend at the moment is to see them as beautiful, quite lovely creatures, as opposed to maybe how they were seen in the past. So I think they're serving probably some combined need at the moment psychologically. Obviously there's a bit of escapism, and they're great fun to escape into. If you think about how previously folklorists have thought of them, Catherine Briggs wrote about them as moving into UFO beliefs. Now we have UFOs instead of fairies, but we're still kind of talking about the same thing. We're talking about something that is other and comes from beyond. We're saying space at the moment, but once upon a time it would have been fairy. So I think they kind of fulfill the need to have a bit of magic in our lives as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And from what I've read, yes, fairies are beautiful, but they also can have a very dark side as well, right? And I think that is probably more accurate to what people believed in previously, that they weren't to be trifled with necessarily. They weren't necessarily bad, but they were not someone that you wanted to, mess with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's the perfect way of categorizing. So we've got like the Victorians to thank for Tinkerbell, the fairies in the bottom of the garden, those famous faked photos. But if we go back to the Tuatha Danann, we go back to the She, they are, they're known as the white people, or the fair folk, or the merry gentry. They're known as these beautiful, powerful beings. Medieval romance, fairy lovers, these creatures who are beautiful beyond imagination, often female, but some male ones as well. It's a really common kind of fantasy in the medieval period. So, pretty much the same as Akatar, right? It's the same as Rhysand, Tamlin, and all the other characters, these fairy lovers. But yeah, definitely they are morally great. They're beautiful to look at, but they're probably not going to behave quite the way you want them to behave. And if you cross them, you do cross them at your peril.
And then also you talk about this liminal space, which is also a term I've seen crop up in a lot more fiction, and maybe that's just because I'm reading more fantasy than I had been before. But you see it in spaces where they're not even talking about fairy lore at all. Liminal spaces seems to be a term that's used in lots of fantasy. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, liminality is an interesting one, and I think it's quite prominent in a lot of people's consciousness at the moment. So we can think of liminality in time. We just had Halloween or Samhain, which is a perfect example of that. The time when the veil is thinnest. So fairies belong to liminality of time. They belong to liminal periods of dawn and dusk, different times of the year, changing of the seasons, that kind of thing. They also belong in liminal spaces where mankind has been but has deserted. So for instance, empty buildings. So you've got like the red caps who inhabit empty towers. You might have different types of sprites and brownies and goblins that inhabit empty farm buildings and stuff like that. So it's kind of a place that was human but no longer belongs to a human. And then there's liminality in terms of the wild, so places where humans go to gather resources, things like wood, berries, out into the forest. And that I think that is a particularly interesting concept with the world that we live in at the moment, with the loss of wild spaces. When these ideas were originally being formulated, like the wild still very much existed. It was a dangerous place. Like if you've ever heard a deer bellow at night and you don't know what that sound is, it's quite a terrifying sound. So for people to try and explain, what was going on in those wild spaces. Liminal spaces are fascinating because they kind of belong to humans, but they kind of don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of where we find fairies. But equally, I think the other place we find them, we talked about it earlier, is in this this liminality of morality. They're not really good, but they're not really bad either. They might do something nice for you. They might go and do your housework for you overnight, but equally they might completely blight your crops or your livestock, and fairy stroke. And so they're really hard to predict in that way.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think there's kind of an attraction in that. I think the human psychology is quite attracted to liminality. So I think where they're quite interesting.
Well, and you mentioned Samhain and Halloween, but also Day of the Dead, which is not quite as celebrated, I guess, in the UK, but it is definitely celebrated in Mexico. And I'm in Texas, so San Antonio is we have one of the largest Day of the Dead celebrations. But this is also, a lot of the culture is Catholic that is celebrating Day of the Dead, but it is also this liminal space where they believe that the souls are the closest that they will be all year long. Is that would you constitute that as a liminal space as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Halloween, right? It's All Hallows. It's a similar kind of concept. It is
Right.
this idea that the veil is thinnest. I think when we think of these days that we celebrate, some of us celebrate with a really conscious understanding of what it is we're celebrating. Some of us just celebrate them because they've kind of been absorbed into the calendar. But I think if we celebrate them and understand the worldview that they come from, we understand that the dead were not so separate to the living as they are perhaps now. It wasn't death wasn't sanitized in the same way that it is now. It was still, um, you know, we only really think of life, and then we kind of don't really think of death at all now. Whereas, for medieval Christians, certainly Catholics, that's still very much alive and kicking, pardon the pun, but the afterlife is as important as this life. So I think that kind of an idea that I played with when I was writing Ferrishyn, because the way I conceived it is I conceived it as planes of existence, different dimensions, which obviously we've seen in sci-fi and stuff like that before. But I suppose it's about having a view of the world beyond just this secular living world that we are all in now.
And why do you think it is that we are so separated from death today, or don't really think about it as much as the medieval Christians did? What is it about today that has changed?
It's a really good question. I think it depends on faith quite a lot. As I think that's one question. So if I was to speak to one of my really good Catholic friends, they wouldn't tell me that they were separate from it. It would still be just as important to them now as it would be to a medieval Christian. They're really concerned. Medieval Christianity is interesting because of its reach. It pretty much took over countries, continents for a period of time, and it was a real unifying belief. And so for them, their concern was not with day-to-day life. Yes, there was a concern around obviously getting food and having a job and all of that kind of stuff. But the soul is really, really important. The fate of your soul is more important than the fate of your body. The body is a husk to them, which is where we obviously get, demons and angels and stuff coming from. So it's the soul that's important, and the soul carries on after death. So for them, this life is not all there is. There's plenty more to come. So it is a very real concern. I think obviously society has changed. We've become more secular. We've stepped back from religion, and this is, it's not even necessarily just Christian religion. We've stepped back from religion generally. So maybe we think less about these kinds of things. We've stepped back from death as well. How many people have seen a dead body? Very few of us, I would hazard a guess, these days. And if we have, it's probably been in very sanitized conditions. Death is not it's not real to us in many ways. It's removed. Even when we think about ways of eating in the modern world, if you want to eat a chicken, you go pick some chicken up from a shop, or sometimes it's even pre-cooked, right? You don't have to go off and slaughter the chicken. So we're so far removed from the cycles of life and death that it's almost an abstract thing to us, and how many podcasts do you see that will talk to you about do this thing and it will make you live a little bit longer? It's not going to stop you dying. It's not going to change your mortality. But we're so, we're so focused on this life and having more of this life. We've kind of forgotten that, it's going to end. And maybe there's something beyond it, and maybe there isn't. But we're focused on the here and now, And I think that's probably where the difference is.
Yeah. Okay, so talk to us about, so did you coin the term Fei-Fi? Or is it
I don't know. I'm going to say yes.
Okay.
I'm going to go, yeah, why not? I did a Google. I can't find anyone else using it. So if anyone else wants to claim it, have at it. It was kind of, you write a novel and you go off and you try and sell it to a publisher and you have to explain what genre it's in. And I would say mine, it blends genres. So it's sci-fi in a sense that we're looking at a futuristic world, a dystopian future in which the Earth has been devastated by nuclear warfare. We're living in bunkers underground. Everything has gone horribly, horribly wrong. So it's futuristic in that sense. And it's very much based in folklore in the sense of humanity's response to that has been to open a fairy portal and to invade a fairy realm, because obviously the fairy realm is this beautiful utopia. So that's kind of where I've gotten. It's a blend of sci-fi with fae and folkloric type ideas. So yeah, if anyone else wants to claim it, go for it.
I didn't even look to see if there was a Wikipedia entry on it, so that would be interesting. So what other? So you have not come across? Have you come across any other works that kind of blend that kind of sci-fi and fairy realm?
Yeah, I think romantasy is kind of doing it a little bit. If you think of what like Rebecca Yarros has been doing with Fourth Wing, I think she's kind of doing it a little bit. So she's got, I suppose, fairly modern ideas of, military. It's not exactly the same. I don't think they've got quite the same technology. I think it's more heavily based in magic, so maybe not. I don't know is the honest answer. If anybody else wants to buy one and prove me wrong, then actually Terry Brooks might be a good example, actually, when he did his he did Magic Kingdom. He did his Magic Kingdom series, and it was set in New York, and he brought a Magic Kingdom. So maybe that's a kind of example. And I think Stephen Donaldson did it a little bit when he wrote More Dance Need. So he wrote a duology, which was very fantasy, not so much fairy, but very fantasy. And then he brought in an element of sci-fi towards the end with a very random space soldier who joins in battle. So maybe there are other people around there that are doing it. So I won't claim it as being entirely unique.
And you mentioned already that at the heart of your story is this eco-critical, eco-semiotic kind of message. Is there anything else that you really needed to get out in the story that you're trying to pass on, or maybe it just was in your head that you feel was important?
Yeah, so for me, my writing is an exploration of people and all these things we've talked about. So, good, bad, morally grey, where how we view the world. So obviously my story Ferrishyn is set within a futuristic war zone. So, the main characters are soldiers. We explore ideas around moral injury, soldiers asked to do horrific things, and the toll that takes on them if they step back and look at really the morality of that. There's an exploration of mental health, PTSD, dissociation, trauma, that kind of thing. And then the other thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to give new life to old stories. So it's very heavily drawn upon the folklore and the mythology of Ireland. So in later books, the She make an appearance, Manannán MacClure, Manx folkloric Fenadiri are in there. You've got the Morrigan, in her various forms as war goddess or fate goddess. And I kind of I hung the whole thing on this Celtic structure of having other worlds, of having Evan and Magmel and Moria and Earth and Tirtangira, which sort of is their afterlife, their place beyond death. So I kind of wanted to write stories that are really heavily grounded in folklore, but that feel real. I wanted to imagine what would happen if we did actually butt up against, the folklore and the fairy tale folk that we've been writing about for so many years. So, how does a modern soldier equipped with rifles, how does he cope with, a fairy? How does he respond to that? And that was kind of what I played with. I wanted to really give it a feeling of reality and a bit of, I suppose, a bit of grit as well. I didn't want it all to be, sparkly magic and love stories and that kind of stuff.
And how many are in this series? I know your first one is coming out in November, but how many do you plan to have in this series?
So Ferrishyn will be a trilogy. There'll be 3 main books, and then there's a prequel and a sequel as well to bookend the main story, just because of the way folklore is drawn in. It makes sense to write it in that way. So my first one obviously is out, as you said, the end of this month. Book 2 should be out next year, and all being well, the 3rd book the year after. And then the prequel and the sequel. After that, there may well be shorter stories. There may well be other bits and pieces. My novella is being re-released hopefully next year with illustrations this time. So I'm working with a folklore illustrator as well, and she's bringing that to life in a very kind of Proudian way, which is quite exciting. So yeah.
And does this one tie in? Does your novella tie in at all to the Ferrishyn series, or is it completely separate?
I want to say it's completely separate. It's separate, but it's got a similar feel. So Gandhi, and again, is set in a dystopian future, but this time, instead of the the humans invading fairy has taken over and the humans are on the run. So it's kind of flipped the narrative.
Yeah, the other way around.
Yeah, so similar ideas, but told in a different way.
One of the things that you mentioned in your work was that in your studies, rather, was that one of the powerful parts about folklore and fairy tales are those textual gaps, those snapshots that readers fill in. Is that possible at all in a novel series like what you're writing, or is it not?
Yeah. So when we're talking about textual gaps, we're kind of going into literary theory a little bit. So you possibly come across structuralism with Prop and Levi-Strauss, who have this idea that fairy tales are kind of hung all on the same. Fairy tales are all hung on the same kind of structure. Like a really easy one would be like the hero and the dragon and the damsel in distress, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of thing. And then post-structuralism, you have Issa, who coins the reader response theory, and his theory is that reading is an interactive process, essentially. So as the writer, I put a certain amount down on the page, and then as a reader, you ideate from my words, you imagine this whole other story from what I've written. So fairy tales do this quite obviously, clearly, clunkily in some ways. They'll drop you straight in the middle of a narrative. Like there'll be, the washerwoman, for instance. You know nothing about the washerwoman. You don't know what her family is like. You don't know how old, you know absolutely nothing. You get dumped into this fairy tale. It will tell you something like, I don't know, maybe she came across a kelpie or whatever it happens to be, and she escaped it or she didn't. And then the story ends, and you're kind of left there. And even the brothers Grimm do it to a certain extent. You're left to kind of imagine all these other things that go on, right? It looks like nursery rhymes. They're the same.
Right.
But when we think of novels and any kind of writing, really, there are natural textural gaps. Like when you jump from one paragraph to the next, it's a textural gap. there are gaps in, the imagery that you create. You'll describe a certain amount, but maybe you'll leave a certain bit out. You'll drop in and out the story. Someone wakes up in the morning, you're probably not told how they sleep, or did they go off to the loo, or all these other different bits and pieces. So there's always natural gaps in stories. And obviously what we were talking about earlier, we were talking about how many books are in my series. It was important to me that I don't want to overwrite. I want to leave the reader with questions. So my favorite stories leave me with questions. They leave me thinking, what happened next? Did X, Y, Z happen? Did this character go off and do this? And I kind of like that. I kind of like things that are unfinished. I think it leaves almost an echo in your mind. And I think that's what's so powerful about fairy stories as well, and folk tales, is you think about this weird little story that you were told, and it leaves all these questions. And that's kind of what I like about it. So yes, as the answer to that question, I'm very much try to do it with my writing. Or hopefully not explaining too much, but just explaining enough.
Does that mean that your stories are not quite as long as some of the other fantasy stories? Because that's one of the things about, reading fantasy. You have to be prepared to really read a lot of pages. I think the first book of the Eco series with Sarah J. Maas was 24 hours. I do audiobooks, so I don't know page numbers. But I think it was a 24-hour book, which probably was in the 600, 700 page range. I'm not really sure, but long. And that was just the first of the series, right? So where does yours lie in that?
Yeah, so I would say, Ferrishyn is sitting at about 450, 500 pages. So it's a fair old chunk of book. And the other two will be a fair old chunk of book as well. But I suppose the one thing I will say is my writing style is quite short and sharp. So I tend to write in kind of short staccato bursts, maybe a little bit similar to a screenplay or something like that, just because of the way. So when I write a novel, I don't sit down and plan chapters. I don't plan anything. I see it in my head. You can see the artwork behind me. I see it. I see the pictures. I ask questions of the characters and I write it down. So perhaps it's a slightly different experience to someone who has sat and planned it all out. And I think the 3 books tie the story up fairly neatly. There's a beginning, there's a clear end with some questions, and hopefully it's framed in a way that's readable. My novella and my short stories, and actually that's what I enjoy writing more, if I'm perfectly honest. So my novella, each chapter is in itself a folk tale, and then you can read all of the folk tales together to make the whole story. And that's, to be honest, that's where my enjoyment is, because you have to be a little bit more brutal about what you write and how much you write, and you have to think about it a little bit.
Now, are they folk tales that have already that exist in the world, or are they folk tales that are just exist in that world that you've created?
No, so they are folk tales that exist in the world, and they're tied together by our heroine, Misha. And she is journeying through this world, looking for her lost pony in this world of fairy. And she is herself a liminal creature. She's a little bit in the forest, she's a little bit out, she's a little bit fairy, she's a little bit not. So each chapter you meet a different folkloric creature. So there are bogarts in there, there's a nixie, there's kelpies, red caps. There's a little English folk tale, which is originally the strawberries and goat's cream, but has been turned into the raspberries and goat's cream. So it's all these strange little stories that are probably reasonably familiar, and each chapter is one of these little stories, but put into Misha's world, with the fairy king Heliquin, who is kind of haunting her steps the whole way, and then her travel companion, who is one of my readers termed him as a waste fairy, which I quite enjoyed, because he kind of shows up when he's not needed and disappears when he is. And yeah, he's quite an interesting character as well. So I have to say that Gandhi and in that world and that way of writing brings me an awful lot of joy. I think it's great fun.
That does sound like a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to reading it. And I did want to ask you, we're getting short on time, but one of the things that you mentioned, which was that you structured it based off of of Celtic mythology. And I just wanted to know if you could give us just a little bit of that story that you reimagined or put into your stories, so that your audience or my listeners who pick up your book might have that in the back of their mind.
Yeah, so Garndeden is British folklore, and that is a slightly separate thing. Ferrishyn is all structured around ideas of um the gods and the old heroes of Ireland. So you've got, like I said, the Tuatha Danann, the people of Danu, the tribe of the goddess Danu, who are the fairy folk, the She. Um, and then you've got Madanam McClure, who takes the role of the fairy king in my story. He is the ruler of the She folk. And then you've obviously got the Morrigan, who is the goddess of some people flippantly refer to her as the goddess of death, but she kind of isn't really. She's a triple goddess. So she takes the form of Five, the battle crow, who foretells death. She takes the form of Nevian, who is the bringer of battle fury and chaos. She's sometimes thought of as a goddess of fate. So she kind of has several roles, but she is she's a living character in my stories. In Jack, who is the king of the Fomorians, the Favori, as they should be pronounced in the in the correct tongue, who are the kind of the monstrous race who do battle with the Tuatha Danann. And then you've got the Fenadiri, who are my little tribe of peace-loving fairy, who are based on Manx folklore. So the whole world is structured on the idea of several planes of existence, the fairy realms, which loosely equate to Celtic mythology, the afterlife. So you've got Evan, or Aun, as it's sometimes pronounced. You've got Magmel, you've got Fomoria, you've got Earth, you've got Tir Tairngire, which is, the blessed afterlife. And that's kind of, it's like a whole other cosmology. And it's held together by the power of the great serpent, who we sometimes will see in loads and loads of different myths. The Ouroboros, the that presence that gives life or a world-ending presence. So it's kind of, it will probably feel familiar to anybody who reads and knows Celtic mythology, and it'll also probably feel a little bit different at the same time. And that's kind of what I wanted to do. I wanted to almost write it in the way that Greek myths are written. The gods are real, they come down to earth, they get involved in human matters, and that was kind of the feel that I wanted to bring into it. So yeah, that's how it's held together with folklore.
How fascinating. So we're coming to the end. We've covered a ton. What did we miss? I know there's probably so much more that we could have covered, but is there anything that you feel like we didn't touch on that you wanted to?
No, I just think it's huge. It's such a huge topic, and there are so many avenues you could go down, and yeah, it's days and days of podcasts worth of discussion. Yeah. But no, don't ring me and listening to me talk for an hour or so.
Well, thank you, Ivy, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, folksy folks, for joining us on this fairy journey. We will be linking Ivy's 2 books on our website on the show notes. So my website is www.fabricoffolklore.com, and the links to her books and also to her website will be there. And if you enjoyed this episode, and if you have a friend who likes fairy stories, make sure that you share this episode with them so that they learn about a new fairy book that is just coming to the market. You can also find Fabric of Folklore on social media. We're on Instagram, on Facebook, and a little bit on Twitter/X. Thanks so much for unraveling the mysteries of folklore. Once again, I'm your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers. And until next time, keep the folk alive.